Charlton, Massachusetts has been home to a vast number of people over the years. From adventurers, inventors, and politicians to soldiers, farmers, and parents. From its inception, Charlton was a classic American small town. On the town's 250th anniversary, we look back to where we originated and look forward to where we are going. Recent development and an influx of new residents has enlarged this small town. Though new faces appear on the streets and new names have been added to the directory, the spirit of Charlton remains unchanged.
Now that it's still standing, I've a story I can tell.
Well, the town of Charlton was established in 1755, and it was a result of a number of petitions from the citizens in the west part of Oxford and an area called the Gore, which is in the north part of Charlton, for a separate town. And they had been protesting the long way it was to travel to the meeting house in Oxford Center, and also having a lot of cattle driven over the west into the west part of Oxford to graze, destroying their crops and making a nuisance of themselves and having no access to the town pound, that they decided that they would try to have their own town. So they petitioned in 1750 and 1754, and finally in 1755 it was granted.
With the granting of their request, the residents of the new town of Charlton had to select and organize its new officials and government.
Well, they met at Ebenezer McIntyre's house, which was in Charlton Common at that time. And he was one of the people who had gotten 100 acres of land earlier in the 1730s and moved up here from, I believe it was Danvers. And he opened his house as a central spot for meetings. And they were held at his house, and the early people were probably the citizens that were most prominent at the time, the McIntyres and the Tuckers and the Dressers and things like that.
Rising tensions between King George III and the colonies came to a head at Lexington in 1775. After this first armed encounter, revolution was inevitable. On June 17, 1776, the town of Charlton voted to support the Continental Congress in declaring independence from Britain.
Well, we had a number of people who were, of course, Minutemen who went to the battles of after Lexington and Concord, but I would say probably a quarter of them were active either in the militia or participating as soldiers.
A sympathizer to the cause of independence and a great ally to America, the Marquis de Lafayette of France offered his services in the war against Britain. He served closely with George Washington during the war. Lafayette toured the now independent America several times. On his visit in 1824, he stopped in Charlton.
Lafayette had come to the United States on the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Bunker Hill as a guest of the United States government. He visited each of the states at that time, and he toured Massachusetts or New England twice. The first time he came was to lay the cornerstone of the Bunker Hill Monument, and then he began his journey through the different states, and he, in the process, traveling to Connecticut and New York, the most practical and most expedient route was on the Worcester and Stafford Turnpike. And it's just so happened that he was able to stop here, and we have the account in the newspaper that he was in the militia lot opposite the tavern reviewing all the militia from the towns around and visiting his old comrades in arms and then coming into the tavern. Well, I think that probably he was the most outstanding person that at that time was known in the United States. Afterwards, I don't know if anybody of what you call renown came through, probably on the train, but they never stopped as Lafayette did and give us the enjoyment of his company. I think that the turnpike, the Worcester and Stafford Turnpike, which you're talking about, I think, was a boon to the area, the north side, especially where it passed through. A couple, 2, 3 taverns opened up. There were people who were called mechanics, millers and things like this, which gravitated to the area where their goods could be transported easily, or more easily, to Worcester and Springfield area.
There was a strong desire to build a railroad west to the Albany, to the Hudson River. And between the Blackstone River and the Chicopee River, there's a whole line of hills running north to south from Paxton, Spencer, into Charlton. And they ran a number of surveys, 8 or 9 of them, and they found that the lesser grades, easiest place to build track would be on the Charlton end. And so Charlton got chosen primarily because it was those grades and those little hills were a big deal in those days, and it was Charlton won out because they had the lesser hills, and it was a better way to go. The first train operated on the Western Railroad through Charlton was October 1st, 1839, the first passenger train.
Our outlooks, of course, our scenic outlooks are probably one of the best natural features that we have. Looking from any of the hilltops that are cleared, you have a magnificent view of the countryside. The granite quarries in South Charlton are fairly well built on now for housing, but at one time they were used extensively for underpinnings and curbings and materials that were used in house construction or road construction.
Charlton, like most of the early towns, was built up from the wilderness of Massachusetts. It was the landowner's responsibilities to develop their lots, and as land was divided into more lots, the town took shape.
When one would come here originally in the 1730s, 1740s, just think of how difficult it was to, first of all, find out where your 100 acres were out in the middle of wilderness. Fortunately, some of the proprietors had the land surveyed so they could find their lots. When they did, then they have the trees to clear to be able to raise crops. And of course, meadows were the great factor. If you had a meadow, which was a swampy area that had no trees, just grass, you had the ready-made hay for your animals until you could clear the fields of trees. Once the trees were down, they probably left the stumps in the ground and just harrowed around it. And of course the soil would have been pretty fertile because it had never been tilled for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so all the humus would be on the top, and that would last probably 20 years without fertilization. And the poorer land then was given over to pasture. But the trees were all cut off in 1830. There were very little woodland in the town of Charlton. The stones had to be picked up and built into stone walls. And everywhere that you see the walls running through the woods today was open, cultivated fields. With subsistence farming, you raised enough for your own benefit, and if you had a little extra, you could sell it or barter it for something else. It wasn't until after the train arrived, really, that the easier way for farmers to deliver their milk to the city or to the larger markets was available. And so then dairying became the primary farming.
We had one milk operation in the 1870s, late 1870s, a large dairy in Boston, the Brigham Dairy, operated a milk train down from Ware and Barry to Parma, and that went east to Boston and picked up the jugs of milk from the farmers all the way in. Later in the day, it returned in the afternoon and deposited the empty milk jugs. And they maintained at Charlton Depot a large ice house, and in the warm weather, that provided the refrigeration. Yeah.
Charlton was to remain an agricultural town for some time. Those who grew up here remember the farm town way of life.
Well, it was chiefly dairy farms, so you milk cows, cared for the cows, of course grew silage, hay, processed it for the winter use.
My family's farm was at 14 Bayless Road, and my grandparents' farm was on top of Prindle Hill. I always told my mother that maybe she was the only person in town who had 2 roads named after her, from her maiden name and her married name. There was both roads in town that were named after her. I don't know if she was the only person or not. But, oh, I really enjoyed it. I liked living on the farm. I liked the life on the farm, although there wasn't a lot of excitement, but it was good. And we had our own food and grew a lot of our own food and had our own milk and things like that. So it was a good life.
Well, like I say, the neighbors all they knew how my father and mother were treating me. They knew it wasn't nice. So they'd call me. Of course, I mowed lawns for Minnie Only, milk cows with Herman Goldinger, and helped bring in the wood for Charlie Holmes, and all the neighbors. And they were all nice. The neighbors were all good to me. I think they felt they knew what was going on over our house anyway. I don't know if they knew what was going on at that time, but they knew I wasn't around. And when I showed up there and was a member of the family, I was 6 years old. Yep, right down there at number 2 school. You'll get a bang out of this one. Alfred Clark was grade 6. And he was right down here. He was in grade 6, and I was in grade 1. And he did something, I don't know what he did, but he did something, and Mrs. Jewett said to him, "You come down and stand on your hands and knees there in front of my desk." So he went down, stood there this way, got down on his knees and standing there looking at the desk. And when I see it, I start laughing. Mrs. Jewett said, "What are you laughing at, Bruce?" She said, "You think it's funny? You going down there with him then." So him and I were down there on our hands, leaning against the desk. And I saw something happen there that lasted right up to about 6 years ago. He took his jackknife and cut his initials in the front of the desk. Only about that big, but AC right on the. And you can go up to that schoolhouse today, walk into see the teacher's desk, walk up around the front of it, and look on the right-hand side, 2/3 of the way up, and you'll see his initials. Well, I saw him writing his initials, and I've had one problem with a group who was going to go into that building, took the desk out and took it up to Charlton Center when I got him through out of the number 2 school. And I went up and I told them, I said, "You bring that desk back and put it in the back in the." They said, "That we bought that desk. Don't tell us what." I said, "You didn't buy it. Don't tell me you bought it." They said, "We can prove it." I said, "I can prove you didn't." He said, "Let's see you." I said, "When I was in first grade, I laughed at Alfred Clark because for something he did. When Mrs. Jewett saw me laughing, she made me go stand on my hands and knees right side of him." And I said, while the two of us stood there, he cut his initials in the desk. I said, "Go around and see if there's initials on the desk up about 2/3 of the way up on the right-hand side." They come back and they said, "Well, we'll bring it back."
In the late 1800s, Charlton began to feel the effects of the Industrial Revolution.
Well, the outlook of Charlton, I think, didn't change with the mills, the introduction of the mills. It always remained basically an agricultural community. The mills began to spring up in the 1830s, 1840s as a result of the demand for manufactured goods, especially wool in Charlton. We'd had a fulling mill very early on, and by the 1840s they had begun to establish mills that would spin the wool into fabric, into threads, which would be manufactured into cloth. But it wasn't until after the Civil War, I think, that the mills began to be predominant, especially in the Charlton City area. There was never sufficient quantity of water power available for large-scale industrial usages, as there was in Southbridge. And of course, Southbridge was seceded. They became their own town early on. So Charlton didn't have the benefit of the Quinebaug River, and the streams that we did have weren't sufficient enough to run the mills efficiently all year round. It wasn't until probably after the Civil War that the advent of steam power in the mills was introduced and they could continuously run year-round. The book that you're talking about is the Manufacturing on Katy Brook. I think there were 22 mills that stretched from the Spencetown line to Southbridge on that one stream and the adjacent streams there. There were sawmills, there were shingle mills, there were grist mills, woolen mills, of course, were the largest ones. There was also sash and blind manufacturing, some of the small industries, handicraft industries, turning and woodworking and things like this.
Most everything was grain and coal, when people burned coal from their homes. and that type of thing. And the woolen mills in the city utilized the railroad. Charlton Woolen was the last one. When they were in operation, they used to get in coal to run their boilers. But most anything to do with farming. And
well, my first job was Bobbin Boy, 1933. And I was the yarn weigher in the spinning department. We made the yarn, and they also made the cloth there. The weaving there and the finishing down at the lower mill on Route 20.
Technology changed the face of transportation in Charlton. The advent of the automobile, the railroad, and the turnpike altered the town.
I think that the turnpike, at the time that it was proposed, was thought to be a great thing. It was very beneficial. I think the town was solidly behind having the turnpike come through, even though a number of people had lost some of their property and their homes for the turnpike. The general overall good seemed to be that it was advancement in becoming more modern. The two service areas that were located in Charlton provided employment for high school kids, which that hadn't been before. And since that time, of course, with all good things, there is a negative side of things, and many people wish that the turnpike was not there.
1911, the first carload of new automobiles arrived at Charlton Depot, and it was Model T Fords. And C.H. Knight was the Ford dealer. He's now the Chevrolet dealer in Southbridge. And they used to unload them from the boxcar, and they'd assemble them right there on the ground and put a little gas in them and drive away.
Well, I can remember when my folks first got a Model A Ford. It was brand new. And it was in the 1930s. And I thought that was really great. I could just remember so clearly crawling into that new Ford and the smell of the new car. I really got a kick out of that. But we had that Ford, and then we had an old Plymouth one time.
Well, it was an agricultural. I wouldn't say farming. I would say agricultural. Farming, milking cows was a big part of it. But we had truck farms, vegetables, strawberries. The biggest thing we changed is we have we had at that time 250 miles of roads that we had to maintain. When I went on the Board of Selectmen, there was 50 miles of roads that were dirt roads, no drainage. So we started a program to mix and place and resurface and surface a lot of roads in our community. Because don't forget, we had our own dump in that days. We had our own school system. We had people that cared. You know, we're open here to the people of this community. A lot of them go 50, 60, 70 miles a day just to go to work.
If she wanted to take us to school when the weather was bad and the road up through here was packed full of snow and they wouldn't open it, she would hitch up the horse, put the harness on the horse, hitch it up to the sleigh, and bring us around the back way to the school up on Dresser Hill and come